Welcome back to the Caregivers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Ropoleski, and you can call me Dr. Mark. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe or follow the Caregivers podcast wherever you're listening or watching. It's free, it helps support the show, and it helps these conversations reach more caregivers and families who may need them. Today, we're welcoming Amy Vasterling back to the show. The first time Amy was here, we talked about caregiving inside dysfunctional families. What happens when boundaries are treated like betrayal, when the reliable person becomes the assumed caregiver, and when siblings don't share the load, and when caregiving pulls an adult child back into old family patterns. That conversation clearly resonated with caregivers. So today we're going deeper. Because one of the hardest parts of caregiving inside a dysfunctional family is what happens after you finally see that pattern clearly. You may do real work on yourself and you may go to therapy. You may understand the guilt, the manipulation, the pressure, and the way your family is always assigned responsibility. But your awareness does not automatically wake up the rest of the family. And in some families, the pattern does not simply sit there, it actually protects itself. The people who benefit from things staying the same may push back. The sibling may seem to see the truth for a moment, then collapse back under the pressure. The family may circle the wagons. The person naming what is happening may suddenly be treated as a threat. So today we're talking about the price of getting free. What happens when a caregiver sees dysfunctional family patterns clearly, but still has to care tomorrow? How do you keep showing up for real needs without surrendering your life to guilt, manipulation, coercion, control, and eventual invisibility? Amy, welcome back to the show. Amy Vasterling, welcome back to the Caregivers podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mark. I'm happy to be back. Yeah,
we're so happy that you are back visiting with us, and we have so much more to explore. So in the tradition of things here, we're going to jump right in. Amy, can you tell me what changes in a caregiver when they finally see the dysfunctional family pattern clearly, but the family still expects them to stay quiet, absorb the disrespect, and keep sacrificing so everyone can just remain comfortable in their roles?
Yeah, I think there's an initial resentment of the realization and, in a way, shock, of how do I know this, and yet I can't reveal it. I can't tell them directly. And I think that's the source of a lot of our pain in the world, is not knowing where we stand or being able to convey, this is my need, or this is how it can be. This is, as I've said in the last one, who I can and can't be. So I think that's where it starts, is something, but you can't really say it. And it's the status quo. We have to find a way to say it. We have to find a way to build that position of, this is where we stand, in order to feel safe, I believe, and feel powerful.
It's amazing how that recognition can feel so liberating, but at the same time, so devastating when a caregiver realizes the disrespect all along was not accidental.
Right.
And the family still expects them to actually keep accepting it.
Yeah, and I see that in my work, is it's carrying a lie. And so we feel that position of, I've been living in a way that isn't real, or we have, I think it goes different ways for different people, but there's some underlying position of, what does this really mean? And there's a beautiful moment there too of what's possible. But I think the grief at first is there and strong, and that's hard, very hard.
Can that grief last a long time?
It can. And I think we we might address it, and then it comes around again in, excuse me. I'm going to just pause a second. So I think that it comes around again and again, and we can address it, and then it might pop up again, and we aren't expecting it. Of course we aren't. Maybe it was a conversation with a friend or something that kind of pushed us there. But there's beauty in that too, in being able to see it again at another angle. And the problem is, we have to stick with what makes us uncomfortable. And again, in my work, I say, deal with ourselves behind the scenes, hold the tension of it until we can see what this can produce that can change something, whether it's with that friend saying a statement that changes the relationship, or that we resolve it with ourselves behind the scenes, and we, in essence, have worked a forgiveness pattern so that they and we feel a different energy between each other. That can be powerful too.
That can certainly capture energy towards healing and a fresh self-realization, if you will. But when a caregiver finally sees the dysfunctional family pattern clearly, I mean, it's so natural to want other people in the family to see it too. What happens when they try to wake everyone up, but the family either denies it, resents them for naming it, or briefly sees it, but then collapses back into that old pattern?
Well, the beauty right there of exactly what you described so succinctly shows that you're in a narcissistic patterned family. Because when they see it and they fall back in or collapse into it, they are following that pattern of narcissism. So that is then undeniable for the caregiver to say, this is indeed what's going on. Because I think sometimes what can be difficult too is when we have that patterning, we're told to second guess it and second guess ourselves. We might be wrong. We might be doing it incorrectly. And that as a result can leave us really confused. But now we have the clarity and we need to step forward and make choices around what is possible and what's right for us. And that's where I think it's really hard for the caregiver, because caregivers that naturally step up to do that tend to care. They want to
Exactly.
show up. They want to help. And they might have to realize this isn't a place they actually are capable of helping. And that's a hard thing to look at and to, resolve within oneself, to accept. That's a better way to say it, to accept.
Yeah, I mean, and let alone taking those first steps or, doing that preliminary testing of how that redefined self can function in that family pattern. It's not a very hospitable ground to do that testing.
Well, so I have some tips for that, and this might be hard to convey on a podcast, but I had somebody in my life who was very arrogant, and at events, they would push each person's buttons. And I decided to look at who I could and couldn't be for that person. And over 2 months of kind of wrestling with myself, what I came to see is I could be very little, if and really almost nothing for them emotionally or mentally, but I could help them physically. I could come and shovel their walk or fix their roof or redo their plumbing. And once I decided that, I could hold love for them that was true and pure, but without any attachment to it, I guess, or any need within it. And once I did that, the person stopped behaving that way with me, but was behaving with the rest of the group that way. So it changed something in the relationship to set that dynamic up and recognize who I can and can't be for them. And I realized I couldn't be much. I never knew that until I looked at it.
It's interesting. It's almost like that concept of gray rocking, but taking it to the next level. But for our listeners today who may not have heard the last episode and time we spent together, you referred to narcissistic patterns where there's so much awareness of narcissism and dark triad personality traits these days. Can we just define a little bit and just review narcissistic social disordering?
Yeah.
Just from the point of view of the family, because I think if we think of the family as an entity as opposed to a person, you could sort of see where the explanation starts to make sense. But I'd like to hear it in your words.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really don't cling to narcissism, even though I've used that term here. I do call it narcissistic
Exactly.
social disordering. And I think of it as it's a pool we are all swimming in, regardless of if we think we are or we aren't. But when we're in a family dynamic that has a narcissist, and we're pretty sure that's what's going on, the social disordering causes, in my son's words, who's in physics, he was saying to me that magnets, once they're heated to a certain state, that they disorder. And I think of the heat is the narcissist, and the magnet is the codependent, or what I say is the enabler, the one who, when the narcissist threatens or is the authoritarian, the enabler feels sorry for the others and tries to reclaim that and make the others feel good. Like, you can do the thing they said, but do it sneaky or secretively. We start making these kind of underhanded deals, or we start to not tell the truth. And that's what follows the line of people not getting their needs really met in a pure, true way. They don't know where they stand. They become uncomfortable. And the narcissist keeps perpetuating instead of the clarity of, that's not right. or the enabler stopping and saying, what are you going to do about that when that person yells at you? How can I help?
Mm-hmm.
And they might say, I need $10,000 to go to a therapist. And you say, I can't be that. I can give 2, but if you come up with the 8, like, we can also be very realistic about it. We don't have to give everything. Yeah.
So just so I understand, so the listeners understand, does there have to be a narcissist protagonist within the family to have narcissistic social disordering in the family?
Not necessarily. That it may not even look
Okay.
that way. I even had somebody in my life that was it's almost like they were an alcoholic without the alcohol. And everybody in that dynamic would say that about that person. So there was no behavior in that direction. So you're right, Mark. It might be unrecognizable. It also, and this is why I also call it social disordering, is it's not that I'm talking about this 1% of people who have this disorder in this way. I'm talking about how we're in the swimming pool of it. It is so prevalent because, to me, it's a needs-based problem. And we've all had a lot of needs gone unmet because of the lack of clear communication.
Mm. I mean, the pattern is so strong and powerful and has such a draw. Why can it hurt so much when a sibling seems to understand the pattern for a moment, but then cannot stand with you once the usual guilt and pressure and manipulation starts up again?
Because of isolation. It's a sense of we want to belong, and that's why we hang in those systems and that disordering. But when the sibling backs off, what we can really recognize is the opposite of what is happening there. You are being brave by recognizing it's going on and looking at what can I do to change that for myself, meaning you might have to have boundaries or step away. But when the sibling isn't willing to come into it, they're showing you how terrified they are of several things. The lack of belonging could be abandonment. I mean, it could be a host of things, but we recognize that's what's going on in them, or insecurity. And that's not going to work for us. We need to.
There's so many steps in the transition for caregivers if they're going to make that leap. I mean, many caregivers are not just upset that the family caregiving burden is unfair. They're upset because once they finally name how unfair it is, the family still expects them to keep carrying it. I mean, what happens to a caregiver when the imbalance is no longer hidden, but everyone just keeps reinforcing it anyway?
Well, they have to be stronger than it. And that is where we tend to cave, because we're carers by nature, we have empathy, we want to help. We have to look at the better thing is for the situation to learn on its own, for there to be some consequences for the person who's ill or the people involved. And that's not easy, but what we're doing is, in essence, we're parenting them. And that's also uncomfortable because it's not something we're potentially supposed to be doing. We could be the sister,
Right.
and we're parenting the parents and we're parenting the siblings, but this is where we're at in our world these days. This is the way, I don't want to say this is the way it is because it's very status quo, but in order to move through to what is more true about humanity, this is where we are and we need to champion it. Yeah.
Is a highly sensitive person who's also a caregiver, or an intuitive who's also a caregiver, set up to suffer more in that dynamic?
Well, I don't think of somebody who's empathic as it being a challenge or an inability. The reality of it is, when we're in power with what is being an empath, we're more savvy in society, and we flow through things. We feel somebody else's emotions and we flow through it. But when we aren't in our power in it, we get stuck with it. I'm going to feel that. And that's where it's not necessarily a benefit to us to look at ourselves as empathic, but more, how do I find the power within that so I don't get stuck in feeling, well, this sister's really upset now, and I don't know, those are old games, instead of what the true power of that is and the notion of being empathic. I do think that the other piece, which is a little bit different to me, is being a highly sensitive. You are the protector for society, whether you like that or not. You can see patterns that others can't see that protect humanity from their own devices. And as a result, you might feel hyper responsible to call things out. Boy, this is the trail that this person we're caring for is headed down. And the siblings might be completely dense to that thinking and so on. And what I've found is you can know that, and that can be enough. And when there's a moment in a caregiving conference or an opportunity with a nurse or the doctor, sometimes we can be asking ourselves inside, can the wisdom come out from me to say the thing that turns the tide right here? And in my work, the quieter we become just by nature, meaning we're not saying as much, the more self-reflective we are about that wisdom, the more of a powerhouse we become by nature. And it's not such a hard-won situation of being an empath or being a highly sensitive. It's just continuing to drive into that power. And HSPs, highly sensitives, tend to be quite wise. I mean, even as children, they're a bit ahead of their time because they can see patterns so adeptly. And that can be troubling if you can see the pattern of, this parent is going to fail or, yeah.
So how does it change the caregiver's anger or grief when the family's now aware of the established unfairness, but is choosing to keep the arrangement exactly as it is?
Well, you have to make choices about that. And again, I think it's based on stepping back in yourself, even if you are still caring for the person, to say, who can I and can I not be? And taking that tension and recognizing, oh, it is very easy for me to be these parts, but I can't ever work with that sibling on that again. But I can with this other sibling. I can come and clean up the house or whatever needs to be done. And then as you can state those things, it gives you more power when they say, we talked about this in the last episode, when they say, well, but you used to go and help with that sibling and so on. And they say, why can't you do it anymore? I can't say. And then they say it again. Well, what do you mean? Because there's going to be emotion. I don't mean the offense to the person who's ill, but it can be burdensome to take care of somebody who's ill. You say it again, and say it calmly. I can't say. And what you're really saying energetically is, I don't know. And you don't know. And they know that's true. They can feel it and they will calm down. They will tend not to get into it.
In some families, then, the caregiver is found to be doing the work, but also protecting everybody else in the family from feeling guilty about not doing the work. Why does the person caring the most often get assigned the job of making sure that nobody else has to feel bad for carrying so little?
Well, that's part of this whole swimming in the pool, is everybody has to feel good, but there's a lie going on. And so it's toxic, right? So they can step out of that. And guilt is useless. Worry is useless. And worry energetically says to others, I don't believe you can. That's not good for somebody who's ill to believe they can, that they're not able. And guilt is preemptively saying, I don't think you can or I can. And it's projected onto the person even further. So it's a deeper level of we can't.
Projected onto the caregiver or the care recipient?
Well, whoever is feeling or giving, sending off the guilt, right? Like setting up the situation for guilt. It's really them saying, I don't think I can, the person dishing out the guilt, or you can. So it's almost this double thing of nothing is going to work here, is really what's being said energetically. And that's also not positive and not good. There's no value to it. It's not helping anybody become stronger.
What about if the caregiver is the source of those guilty feelings onto themselves?
Yeah. Well, you need to stop. And it's that behind the scenes awareness of, I am letting go of this guilt. And it might be having to remind yourself again and again and again, I'm not going to be in that guilty place or give out the guilt. And listening, like sometimes I might say to a client in this situation, record the conversation you're having with these people and listen to it later so that they can recognize where is the pattern of where they're saying things. Because guilt is really coming out because something isn't working and they are insecure and they're pushing this out to kind of be in control, but it's controlling. It's not truly control. It's power, or, they're not in their power in it. It's control.
I think that reviewing those scenarios and those conversations post hoc is probably a really powerful tool. But translating that further, how does a caregiver know that they're not just providing care anymore, but they're managing the family's guilt, denial, anger, and discomfort too? Like if I'm a caregiver, What's the moment of realization, and what would I feel in that moment?
Well, I think it might be after the fact. You might feel immediately as you're dishing out some guilt, you feel some sense of power or I'm okay. And then a second or two later, you feel that gut, like sick in your gut. You might leave and ruminate. You can't let it go. You might talk to people about it outside of that environment more than is needed. So I think the symptoms could be many, but I do think it's the immediate sense of power that it's not, it's control. And then the gut punch of like, oh, I don't feel something's not right here. And you're
And
participating in that.
combine that, combine that with care recipient anger or sibling anger, and then the tendency to denial, which might just brush everything under the carpet. The caregiver in that instance can find themselves kind of like snakes and ladders back down to the bottom of the board.
Right. And the person dishing out the guilt is honestly, in my eyes, they're doing it to survive. And that's no way to live. You know when you're aligned with what you're giving because you feel good about it. You don't say to your friends, well, I'm taking care of this person. You know you are, and you don't need to say anything,
You don't need to broadcast it.
That's right. And get credit.
Well, there's a particular kind of grief that sort of comes when you realize the family may never become fair, no matter how clearly you explain it to them and explain your transformation. What does that realization do to the caregiver, where they feel like they're just talking to a wall?
Yeah, there's nothing that it is going to help them with or do for them. It, in a way, is showing them this is hard, but you don't belong here. It's not a working environment. And you might need to make choices around, I can help in these ways when nobody's around. That you might help in ways where you are outside of it, you stay on the periphery and support from a different angle, or that you can't support, but that's a messy piece.
Well, it does fragment the support, but it also allows you to perhaps participate in things that won't get you fired up and won't get you distressed, but still a contribution all the same.
Exactly.
So how does someone then stop arguing with reality and start making choices from that awareness of what the family actually is and not what they just keep hoping them to become?
Right. Well, it's expectation, but you're never going to get them to become who you want them to become by force. If you let go in a myriad of ways, they can maybe shift and come along with you. But oftentimes it's accepting that there is a lie there. There is some mistruth or some level of system going on that is not a functional human way of being, and that is harming you. And you don't need, again, the person who just knows that and takes that away with wisdom and says, okay, I'm okay if XYZ, and makes peace with that, is going to have an easier time than somebody who resists and says, come on, you have to be how I need you to be. Really, what that person needs is a place to belong where it makes sense. And that might not be with these people, but it's not saying you can't be with those people. It's just where you truly belong. You might have to find outside of your natural family or your group, of people that are caring for this individual. Yeah.
So then in many families, the person who stays and follows through, and those that we're talking about dysfunctional families with different levels of dysfunction, but the person who stays and follows through becomes the default caregiver. How does one person's reliability turn into everybody else's permission for them to essentially disappear into caregiving?
Well, that's exactly what the people want. And so they did their work and pushed in that system. And now here we are. You're doing all the work. So, and we've talked about this, they might be getting credit for it. Oh, look at what I did. I showed up with flowers, But that's exactly what you want to mitigate, is in going behind the scenes, in the quiet moments when you're in the bathroom for 5 minutes by yourself, recognizing what does and doesn't work for you, and then setting that in, as the tone of, you're going to have to pick these other pieces up. And that's difficult, but it is the antidote. Or maybe a wealthy sibling and they can pay for care to cover that. I mean, it could be any way. It doesn't have to be the expectation that they do it or they do it a certain way.
It's such a dynamic realization and a dynamic path to walk with a lot of introspection that has to come along the way. If ever there was a place for journaling as a caregiver is trying to renegotiate their place in the dysfunctional family dynamic, I think that would be like the logbook that allows you to look back and just, okay, this is my trajectory. This is where I'm headed. This is what I'm thinking about today.
Right.
So there's a lot that needs to be captured, and recollection, I think, of that process is so huge.
Well, and Mark, I like that because I hear sometimes in some therapies that are offered in psychology that they are things that are, just distract yourself over here. That truly is what they're asking the person to do. And what I like about what you're saying is it's like recording the conversation, but in a way that you can look back at the snapshots of information and say, oh, there is the pattern. And what's important about it too is when you're caregiving, it's intense. And so you might not be able to process everything going on, but if you look back a year later after it's quiet, the person is hopefully healed and well, that then you can start to sort out, boy, that's what was going on. And this sister is worth me going the distance and seeing if they go to therapy with me. This one isn't. It might be those types of choices, but absolutely. And I do think I want to stress that can cause more stress for a caregiver because it's something else to do. So in a way, I would ask them if they were going to do something like that to relate to it as a revolving situation, not an everyday have to do 5 minutes, there's no expectation, but more when you are feeling that moment that you guilted and you recognize it because the gut then gets, ouch, this isn't working. I did something that wasn't, right for me. That you think, boy, later today, I'm going to, do a little bit of journaling on that. And that you make it fluid so it works with your life and you're not adding more and forcing it.
I think that's one of the biggest problems these days, which leads to that scenario of like, I don't feel any better, yet I'm doing absolutely everything that the checklists tell me to do.
Right. But that's part of the old system. That's the problem that we're swimming in is you do. Up level, do this better, be more and more and more. And I know for people like mothers, even that level of caregiving, it's a lot, or a stay-at-home parent, I'll say it that way. The more, focused parent with children, it's a lot. Yeah. To do something more. And this idea of self-care, like we have to care for ourselves. We shouldn't have to even say that. It should be natural. We shouldn't have to call out,
That's
I have
true.
to go and have self-care. It should just be, I went to have coffee in the city with my friend, or I went on a long walk. That's it. But we call out. That's how far away from ourselves we are that we have to call it out and label it. And that to me is not healthy.
I really like how you refer it that way. We were back to our knowing and our self-intuition. We wouldn't have to call it self-care.
No.
Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Amy, a lot of caregivers say, I am not the only child. I am just the only one treating our parents' decline, safety, and care needs as real. So why do siblings raised in the same family create such different stories about what they owe to the parent and to the sibling carrying the load?
Well, I'm going to say from my own experience, maybe this first, is I have found the children that, in this scenario with a parent, the children that the parent was the hardest on, those children either rebel or they're the nicest to the parent. And so those children that were nicest to the parent tend to be the ones that are the caregivers because they have so much empathy. I mean, I think of one of my siblings as, I always think of her as a golden retriever. This is bad, but she was never kicked, but you could kick her and she'd lie down and be like, rub my belly, I'm here. This very much lay down and die for others because of the fear of abandonment. And I think that there's the problem, is if she's aware of that fear of abandonment, she can recognize and really feels the depth of that and recognize she can get that need met someplace else. She might come through. So I'm saying this to point out, you may be caring for somebody who wasn't kind to you, and you may be doing it because you have a lot of empathy, you have the ability, but there's also this moment where you need to recognize, did that person originally do that to you because they never had the consequences that were necessary? They were sheltered from those consequences, and that's what got them treating you this way in the first place. And do you now need to, even though it's especially hard with somebody who's aging, let them have some consequences so that they start to respect and feel the measure of what is actually being served to them instead of, some people can be very condescending and mean, and you're giving a lot, and they don't even begin to recognize. And it's not that we need validation, it's more that we need the good tension of the person who is ill to help make decisions, to be invested in their own care and in their own health journey. That it can't just be us saying, you need to take this medicine, oh, you can't eat that, oh, you right? Yeah.
If we're in touch with our own knowing and our own authentic self, shouldn't we be protected from feelings of abandonment?
Potentially, yeah, because you're not in a system where you're looking for outside validation, where you're looking, you belong to you, and then others treat you that you belong. Yeah. And that's a crisis in our world. So we can't, I'm telling your listeners, don't feel bad. That's at epic crisis levels of people feeling misunderstood is a lot of where that comes from. And that's chronic in North America for parenting. We parent to misunderstand the child right off the bat. Anyway.
Yeah, you referred to that in your book, and it was a compelling argument when I read it, and made me reflect on my parenting journey as well. Are siblings really fighting about their parents' care, or are they fighting to protect the vision of the family story that lets them live with their choices?
You just summed it up right there. Yep, and that a lot of families want to look good. So it's, if we look good, we're okay. If we sound good, we're okay. And they're living in that. And that's where it's a lie. We can be imperfect and be the most beautiful in that positioning. But if we're not willing to see that, if we're not willing to let the sibling break down and cry, who needs to cry? And we say, why are you doing that? Or whatever that is happening, the behavior that we push away or say that's not okay because we have expectations that aren't realistic. We don't know what that person needs. That becomes the problem. We're trying to get them to hold something that they aren't.
It's interesting how often you sort of hear in the face of family collapse, outside voices saying, oh, but they were the perfect family.
Exactly. And they tend to be the ones that they looked good, but inside, behind the closed doors, there's a lot of, I think, emotional and mental issue going on, communication. Yeah.
One of the hardest things that caregivers describe is that the people doing the least often have the strongest opinions. And so what happens inside the caregiver when family members who barely show up criticize their every decision as a caregiver?
Well, they might acquiesce because they might be so afraid of that abandonment, and that's how they've been conditioned, and they're stuck in that. Or they might
abandonment from a sibling?
Well, and the idea of being cast out, like if I buck the authority here, if I say this isn't true or that's not right, or that can be, well, you're wrong, and then all of a sudden we're isolated. Like some families have one person that always has to be on the outs, or, these dynamics, right? So there can be a problem within that very expression of, if I do anything, there's going to be negative pushback, or there's going to be a worse situation than just acquiescing. And so they hold that position of the dynamic instead of getting things to straighten out and be imperfect and clear.
I imagine within dysfunctional family systems, it sometimes happens that one sibling actually carries the voice of the whole family, hence the threat of abandonment if it's one voice you're up against.
Right. And it can be. I think sometimes there's a child in the family who will push at the parents a little more in I'm the parent. You can have that dynamic where that's ugly for other siblings, for sure.
Is there a way a caregiver can actually stop processing the criticism from people who aren't showing up and stop treating it as the same or with the same weight as the responsibility to the actual care for the recipient?
Yes, in letting it roll off your back and learning the power of how that works for you. That's where the journaling comes in, or just simply, how do I let that roll off my back? And it might all of a sudden elicit incredible tears because you never let yourself have that, and or you might emote, but if we can let it roll off. And in essence, what you're talking about is a forgiveness process, which is, I'm sorry for any hurt I've caused. I forgive you for any hurt you've caused. And now here's how I want to see things. And in this case, we might say, I want to experience a sense of freedom and expansiveness with this situation. Or I want to enjoy the time that I have with the person who's ill. So we set the tone for something different. And then as we come around to that, which might not be a one-time shot, we can move into where that seats. We feel better about it. I mean, if we could learn this as children, we'd have no problem doing it as adults. But this is how twisted up and challenging that system has become in your dynamic. The harder it is to let that go.
Yeah. If ever there was a call for self-compassion, it has to be really evident for the caregiver embarking on this journey to get back in touch with their knowing of their authentic self. It's not a static one moment event, it's a process. And it's going to, as you clearly point out, have lots of bumps along the way. But if you can't show yourself self-compassion during that process, it could be exponentially more painful.
That's right. And the other piece to that is, if you can't show yourself self-compassion, it's okay to even say, I can't do that. That frees you up more than you know. So we can go easy into that journey. And the other caveat to what you're saying, Mark, is this is something that's been around a long time, this problem, the model, and it's built up over centuries. And so now we're finally saying, okay, we're not going to be doing that anymore. And so we also can think of ourselves as doing something epic. And that maybe if we look at it that way, we can recognize it doesn't have to be done quickly or perfectly, or we just take our time and move through these situations, and it will be good and it will be hard and but we're going to keep feeling until we've expressed through and say, oh, I'm feeling strong enough to say the thing I need to say this time. And I don't need to use guilt to lash back at the painful things they're saying to me, the criticisms, the judgments. It's powerful.
Well, I think that really resonates, because I think there's a temptation to sort of say, if you don't have self-compassion, you're toast in this process. Like, you'll never get through. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's okay to struggle.
Yeah.
With self-compassion.
It's human.
Maybe more authentic and human than anything.
Yeah. Especially in a world that drives to produce and to look shiny and, have such high expectations of what humans should be. Yeah.
Caregivers often say they feel trapped not only by the care, but who they become while doing it. We've talked about resentment, reactivity, feeling of numbness, and constantly on edge. What are the signs that caregiving is not just hard, but is actually actively crushing the person doing it?
The emotions of feeling like I feel sad and I don't even know why, or I feel this heavy burden and I can't explain it, or I feel stuck. And they might point to a place in their body, but they don't know why. I think, and the other side of it, why not be messy when somebody's ill and use it as a gift to yourself to move out of that system? It's a hard time because it's a stressful time, and there can be post-traumatic stress disorder and all of these things going on. But it also is an opportunity to say, enough. This isn't who I am, and it's never who I've been. And it won't help me to be somebody I'm not. And even claiming, I don't like that. But I must move forward and break out of, I liked how you put your hands together, break out of that shell.
It's pretty tough to do if you're a solo caregiver and you're dealing with the dysfunction within the family, to find that space and that energy to choose self in the face of an ailing parent or an ailing care recipient. Not an easy task. I think our listeners struggle with that. The comments I see popping up on social media are just that. How do you do it alone? Not just alone, but alone with yourself, if you're not in touch with yourself?
Well, it's not easy. And I think being a solo caregiver is it has a little different caveat. You get all the say, but you need to look outside of yourself for other opportunities. We talked about this in the last podcast. Are there groups that can come out? Are there ways that you can get help? Can you be really resourceful or ask somebody to be resourceful on your behalf? Maybe somebody else that's cared for somebody that isn't caring for somebody right now. What do you know of? Can you help me get some things set up? But there is that recognition of you are calling the shots. And that's stressful because you're making decisions for another person in some time, at some points. There also can be the freedom of not having the burden of others judging you and putting this pressure on you. So then can you ask yourself, how do I take the pressure off of myself? Can I have that neighbor bring meals? Or what is it? Be really resourceful. People do want to help us. I mean, I travel all the time, and I swear 99% of people want to help you figure it out, get to where you're going, answer the question. And you might be surprised. They might need that too. That sounds funny, but even going to a church you're not a part of and saying, I need help. Can you just, what resources are here that can help? Are there people that can come and sit with the parent or, don't hold back and ask for help to get that help if you need. But reach beyond yourself. Don't think it has to solely be you, because that can be incredibly heavy. Incredibly heavy.
Oh, I think, and we feel that sentiment in the comments that we receive. So I'm going to push you a little bit harder. How can someone actually tell the difference between normal caregiving exhaustion and the deeper warning signs that they're truly disappearing inside that role?
Well, I think it's when you have a day that you don't have things that you needed to care for the person, and you take an hour and a half time to just watch a dumb movie or be, and you feel filled up after that. But it's when that doesn't fill you up and you don't want to get off the couch and that's compounding. It's when you can have some free time or take a walk or do something. If your body is still tired, if your mind is still, I can't, it's compounding and it's too much for who you are. And the other piece of it to keep in mind is that might not be that much for that person. And you can't judge that that's too much for you. You're not the same person. And we don't like that. We're taught to be the same. And so you have to let go and realize that's just not how it works for me. I know it's not fair because it's not like, here's the solve, but we have to go easy. We really do.
When caregiving pulls someone back into those childhood patterns, they may start appeasing, explaining, freezing, trying to earn approval from a parent who's now dependent on them. Why does an adult caregiver become the child again so quickly and easily?
Because they're posturing in the system and they're trying to make that other person feel like they're in charge or make that other person feel like whatever the thing is that person needed when they were young. But we can quickly recognize I'm not going to be that person. I can't be that person because maybe the child or the caregiver clearly they never should have been playing a role. They should have been being themselves. And I will say this, based on what you asked, Mark, the quieter the caregiver is, the more the person dishing out whatever it is, whether it's a sibling, the judgment, the criticism, or the person who's ailing, gives that to the caregiver, the more quiet they are in a powerful way of they're not with their shoulders down, but standing tall and being there for it, that person will hear themselves over time. That sounds crazy, but if you're not going to take it, it has nowhere to go. And you're not saying, I'm not going to take that. You simply, that is our knowing. You stand powerfully and just let them say it all. There's nowhere it can go. They see it. They feel it. And they have to reconcile or own their own thing, their own words.
How is it then that someone may have over the years stepped away from the dysfunctional family dynamic, embraced their own knowing, yet when it comes to an ailing parent and caregiving, they get pulled back so easily?
Because of old patterns. I mean, it just is so easy. That's what I said.
It's amazing how powerful they are, though.
And it can resurge, especially when there's a moment of weakness. I think a lot of families that have dysfunction tend to do well in chaos, and that's how the caregiver can do well for a while. But then there's a point in which that burden has become so heavy, they're exhausted at a deeper level. And that's where you can't just rest for a while and take time to do whatever. You might also find you guilt yourself for taking that time. Oh, I shouldn't have gone on that walk. Now I've got 2 phone calls or 2 voicemails or, from this person, whatever. But maybe you need to give those voicemails another half an hour, or tell the nurse, I'll come and sign that thing on Thursday and it's Sunday. Like we need to realize if they push, we can say, I'm human. I'm not a robot.
I think I know the answer to this question, but we'll see if I'm right or not. How can the caregiver stop reacting like the old child version of themselves?
Well, they can look at how they are powerful in other areas of their world and then simply apply that. How do I speak to this person?
Adapt it in.
What's that?
Adapt it.
Yes.
Their strength from elsewhere into that scenario. Yeah.
And that other piece of staying quiet, because if you listen and you're in that powerful stance and I'm letting this kind of roll off of me and I don't like it, but I'm doing that, you will start to hear the repetition of what's going on. And, I've been traveling a lot and I've been talking about North Americans, this is strange, and saying, we're quite a negative bunch. And then one of my friends she immigrated from another country and she lives in England now and has lived here 40 years. And some of her family went to North America. And she said, Amy, they complain an awful lot. And they had the same formative years. But I think culturally we can get into that. And we don't have to. We can change the tide. We can let it roll off. We can hold that powerful, I'm not doing this inside of us, and let it be reflected back in the mirror to them of, that's not going to fly. And honestly, that's what the ill person is looking for. Even though it doesn't seem like it, they're in a hard situation. And I think this is what makes it incredibly hard is they're hurting and you feel sorry for them. And you've got to stop feeling sorry for them and help support how they can feel good about themselves and how they can believe in themselves. And that's your only job in truth. And that's really hard because it's not culturally in our entire world something we really set out to do. We set out to tell, oh, if this, then that, be warned. We're preemptively trying to help people not feel emotional. And that's dumb. Let them feel emotional and show up and hold their hand. Look in their eyes. Let them feel it and they'll be over it. But we don't do that. And that's probably why the caregiver feels so awful too, is they're never let off the hook for their emotions. They're just stuck in them.
Even if you're practicing trying to reflect it back, there's still that residue inside of you, which you can stay trapped in and you can hold on to. But I think it's important to acknowledge that those residues have half-lives to them and a certain decay factor. And if we let them decay and we let them pass through us,
right,
they actually can
be neutral, where we remember the memory, but it's not the charge. And I think too, I'm seeing this more than I ever have, is a lot of people will say, oh, that's victim mentality. And I say, you know what? There actually are people who are victims. And then but we don't give that any credence we just steamroll over people who have actually been victims. And as a child, you likely were a victim of things if you're in a dysfunctional family, legitimately. And people have just told you, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, suck it up. These messages that are status quo, instead of actually meeting you and, like I said, holding your hand, maybe making eye contact, just acknowledging you have pain. And I've had that happen recently in my life where somebody saw shock and pain in their eyes for something I had shared, and I didn't mean to share it. And I've never had that. And I thought, this is the most powerful thing that's ever happened for me, is somebody can acknowledge my pain without uttering a word, but I see it in their eyes. It was incredible. And that's knowing at its deepest level. It changed a lot for me in a moment, a second.
I can imagine there are many caregivers who would embrace a moment like that.
Oh, absolutely.
Folks, we're going to take a brief break and in the tradition of the podcast, tap into our illustrious production team who always have a couple of good questions ready for our guests.
Hi, Amy.
Hey.
One of the things that have come up in the first part of the show have been around the lie, like, carrying the lie or living with something or trying to go along with something that and you're holding inside isn't right. And then you start to feel terrible about it because you're just sort of going along with that. And that happens a lot in these kind of systems, these dysfunctional family systems. And I think once you see that, though, once you see the lie for the first time and recognize it for what it is, you can never sort of see your family and the dysfunction in a similar way. I mean, for me, maybe that was my wake-up point. I remember once, and I think I was only about 15 or 16, but we were having this big family meeting, and it was with my extended family, and my aunts and uncles, my grandparents were there, and something had happened that was so clearly unfair. And yet the sort of the regime at the like the family regime, the family system, was just going to sort of plow forward and not recognize it. And I looked around. I remember looking around the table and seeing everyone's expression and seeing people who were just going to sort of accept it without a second thought. And then I saw a bunch of people sort of processing and feeling that I could see that they felt it or recognized that it wasn't right as well. And yet they just stayed silent, and I could see them almost pushing it down in their expressions. And then the whole system just sort of lurched forward from there, and it wasn't dealt with. And that was my moment of recognizing, like, this family structure isn't exactly what it pretends to be. But it's also like waking up from that for the first time can be, I don't know, it's like, it's almost shocking or something, like to realize there's a separate reality from the one you've been sort of programmed into. Could you speak to that a little bit and how sort of awakening from the big lie starts to allow you to sort of see who you are within the system and whether or not you can sort of stay or you have to step out?
Yeah, that's a big question. I do think it does leave us in shock when we realize and we really feel it inside of our body. So it's visceral. It's not just this mental realization. We can tend to shove that away like most of the people it sounds like did at that event. But the piece of it that I think is important to focus on is you do know, and now you have the power of choice. And in a way, the choice is our only manual transmission movement into something different. So we can recognize, like, if we were, say you're a child when that happened, you're 10, and now you're 23 and you meet a partner that you think, boy, this person is great, and you see a red flag. Because you know that system in your family, you acknowledge the red flag and you clear it with them. You call it out and you say, hey, this doesn't work for me. This is XYZ. And see where they come in. And that helps you move into a future that stops the lie in your life. But I think I had a very different situation, and this is what led me into my work, is when I was 7 or 8, I had family situations like that where I could call out the person who said the thing in a few words, and they would stop for the rest of the day. And what I realized is what's necessary there to change the tide is actually parenting. So we, as a child or the adult or anyone in the room, and I believe what it takes is the person so strong in the belief that not this is wrong, they're not resisting against the person, but believing this can be changed. This can be different without saying it or any drama or any of the pieces of guilt. So you're not reinforcing that system that was already broken. Instead, you're meeting it at a different angle and coming in and saying, blop, 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 and the person changes because to me, I see it as the mama cat biting the baby cat on the neck and saying no. And that there's a power to it. So if you can change it in the system right there. But I don't think that's very common. I do think as you grow, you recognize it in relationships and look back and say, boy, that is a little bit of a gut clench for me. There is a red flag there. I think the first person I was married to, there were some red flags there and I did not address them. That was my old patterning, right? I just kept trying to see the good and the positive. And that's where in our world, people say, be positive. And I think, great. It's not wrong to be positive, but there's also this necessary piece of being honest. And sometimes we don't feel positive. So being positive all the time is kind of overriding what's human. We want to be honest and be able to clearly state, hey, I see this thing and that's not going to work for me.
I think maybe what the
So even
takeaway
having
from that, sorry, I think maybe the takeaway from that is instead of going on a crusade to necessarily change the dynamic within the family, just to step back and understand that if you are unwilling to say something when you feel like something is wrong, the chances are later in your life, you're going to accept all kinds of things that you shouldn't, and that are going to cause pain and discomfort because you don't have the ability to actually speak out when you feel something is wrong or unfair. And that you learn that early, and then you can't sort of apply it later on because you learn just to be silent. I don't know, that's what I sort of pulled out of what you said there. And I really got the example of when you said the red flag later in the relationship, you're able to sort of identify it, and not only just identify it, but actually say something and advocate for yourself, because you're not, you didn't choose to remain silent and sort of under the thumb of the family system. You've sort of learned and have the ability to now advocate for yourself and make different choices. So that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
It sounds to me like it's a question of when are you prepared or willing to deal with processing the pain? Whether you're 30 in that extended family meeting and the pain that comes from speaking up, and potentially the pain and trauma from a self-rebirth in that family dynamic, versus the lingering pain that lasts for 3, 4, 5 more decades after age 30 as you've remained silent.
Right. And some people, there's a writer who, he's no longer living, but he is quoted in saying, it's Richard Peck, which not to be confused with Scott M. Peck, but he wrote for young adults, and he is quoted in saying, humor is anger that's gone to finishing school. And I think that, so in a family dynamic like that, there might be somebody who's funny and they say something to neutralize the system going on there, but they don't relieve the emotion. They relieve it temporarily to be like, we all see it, and I'm going to make the room feel comfortable. But that's just one step. That doesn't change what's really happening there in a greater way. But yeah, it is possible.
You witness those individuals, they're working the room hard.
They are. Well, and they tend to
often
meet
it can
things.
be exhausting.
Yeah, it can be, but they tend to meet things that way with humor. Yeah.
So, Amy, a lot of people assume that once a caregiver sees the dysfunctional family pattern clearly, or does enough work on themselves, that the pattern will start to lose its power and change. But therapy changes the caregiver. It doesn't change the family. So why do these dysfunctional family patterns so often protect themselves through the people who benefit from keeping things exactly the way they are?
Well, because it's comfort is what they know as home inside, but it's not their true home. So they're never settled. They might be anxious. They might project anxiety. But that's the difference in my work is it actually changes the family dynamic, because the person changes in a way where they're unflappable. And I say to some people that need to step away from their family as a result of family dynamics, you might not always have to, but you'll know if you don't anymore, because you'll know that you're strong enough to be there and be unflappable. You won't be triggered by the things that used to trigger you. But we are in a time when we're expanding and changing massively, and that's going to, I think, it will collapse narcissism. We will change it so much, so many of us, that won't really be able to exist, the dysfunction, because the lie won't be untold. It won't be called out either, but it will be seen, because it will be unavoidable.
So I think that's an amazing point that you just made, which I think our listeners really need to focus on, is that the work on ourselves and the therapy we may go through is the preparation to then re-enter the scene as unflappable. But just doing the work doesn't make you unflappable, nor does it change the family.
Right. It takes, I think, a greater audacity inside to say, this isn't my pattern. I respect these people. And in my case, I say they're my greatest teachers, but it doesn't mean that I can always be there or ever be there or whatever. And we make peace with that. And that's powerful and beautiful. And it's not my job to know if they like it or not. And that's tricky too, right? They don't get a say in it. Yeah.
It requires a level of self-confidence that a lot of people may not be prepared to display, but maybe some of that upfront work and learning about oneself and going to therapy can actually prepare someone for that next phase.
Right.
How can a caregiver... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, Mark, we also have to adopt the notion that there is a place where all of us belong. We really inherently belong as we are. And the allowance of letting that be found is part of the journey. And it might not be with those people. And I know you're caregiving, you're responsible, you're these things right now. But when we know that in our minds, sometimes that can help us have the tether to, I will find that. As I'm doing this healing process, I will find that and know that.
Does that exercise maybe actually prepare someone for when the caregiving journey is over so that they can reintegrate into life as truly themselves and truly where they belong?
Yes, versus carrying the guilt and the shame of what they couldn't be while they were a caregiver. Because, hey, everybody, that's going to happen. You're not going to be able to be everything. You just won't. You won't do everything right when you're caregiving. It's impossible. And so, yep, having that mind set, I think really does help.
So how can a caregiver recognize when a sibling, relative, or family member is not just disagreeing about care, but protecting their own power, control, and influence and safe place in the family?
Because it feels slimy. It feels deeper and older than what is just on the surface right there in the dialogue. And you know it. You can feel it in your body, I am certain. You might step away and think, that is what? You're going to know. And it's subtle. And we think, well, like we've said here, we'll just override it. And that's part of what was conditioned in you and is the trauma of the disorder, is you were told to override yourself instead of know. So trust that you do know and recognize, if they want to call the shots, well, then let them have that reign and then see how it works for them. Or, can you give them something that shows who they can and can't be in it? It displays their functionality and their non-functionality in the situation. It's a consequence.
In a dysfunctional family, then, who usually becomes the person who protects the pattern and enforces the rules or punishes the person who tries to step out of line? And why might that person not be the parent who actually needs care, but someone else in the family?
Well, they may have traits that are highly narcissistic in themselves, meaning in my work, it would say they have a needs-based problem that they shove so far down that they're doing anything in their power to thwart so that they don't reveal that. And they say, you're the anxious one, when actually that person is very anxious. There are a lot of projections, or there's a lot of blaming or gaslighting. And I can't say who it is in the family. I do think that sometimes it can be the sibling that is closest to that parent. If it's a parent that's ill, or closest, like it might be the oldest sibling who's like, I have to be responsible here and take, and be in charge and tell you what to do. I think the dynamic can change. I'm in a family where I'm separated by so many years. I'm a first again. So psychologically, I'm like a first and a last child. So I think on both parameters. When you have dynamics like that, it changes things, right? So it's hard to say, this is the definitive character who will be the one upholding, this is how the family works. Might be the man, or, it's just hard to say. Like the one brother.
Some family members, as they witness this sort of transformation in the caregiver, may see enough to know that the situation's wrong and the history is wrong, but still will not risk losing approval, money, inheritance, belonging, or a sense of peace. What does it do to a caregiver when somebody briefly stands with them and then backs away once the price of standing by them becomes real?
Well, it's hardship. I mean, I think it's
That's brutal.
Yeah, it's that whole position of belonging and the need to belong. And I am working around this idea, a notion of, I think attachment inherently makes us a victim. I'm in that camp right now. But connection is something that is undeniable. We can, with a love partner, we can feel connected to them even when they're distant, or a family member that we truly have love for them and they have love for us. But with attachment, we're constantly looking and seeking and trying to know instead of know inside of ourselves, right? It's kind of the opposite. So I'm not sure. I've kind of talked in a little bit of a circle. I hope that that's answered your question. You carry on with more if it hasn't quite, but.
No, it does. And, speaking of circles, then it's that circle of loneliness because, how can a caregiver then survive that loneliness of seeing the dysfunctional family pattern closely, especially when the family actually circles the wagons and treats the person naming the truth as a threat?
Well, I'm going to go a step not to the family, but I'm going to go to the outer layers. So say that the center is number one, and then the next layer of people in our life, our friends and our others, cousins and aunts and so on, is layer two. And that layer two tends to not have so much compassion for that situation. Well, everybody has to caregive. Everybody has to go through this at some point in their life. And I think that sometimes when we can't think beyond this immediate family situation and we know that the dysfunction is there, we can't even think to a secondary group of people who have our back, who are saying, I see what's going on. And so we're in this pivotal place of, am I crazy? Did this person that was just with me on it and now isn't? It feels divisive to us, and we feel even lonelier because we do feel alone in it, in the sense that there isn't somebody who, like I said earlier, can just hold our hand and let us feel. And that's safe. And they don't have to say anything. They just allow us to let ourselves off the hook for what we're feeling. So when we get into these dynamics of family, I sometimes think the caregiver can't see the total scope because they're so in it in the moment of what is actually going on there that is dysfunctional. Might sense some of it, or they might see some of it, but in the greater scheme, it's a lot. It's a lot to take in. And this is where I say your ally to yourself is to, behind the scenes, when you're on the elevator leaving the care facility, take a second and get in there deep with yourself to just feel inside and be with yourself and challenge that structure of, why do I feel so, whatever it is, guilty, shameful? What is that? Because what I want you to tell yourself is that is not real. None of those things are actually real. They're old behaviors that are just cycling around. And if you can push back at that, you'll start to break it down where you become that strength. But it takes that moment of not just shoving it under the table or riding over it, actually being
So if I understand correctly, that honest exercise with yourself and maybe some of the answers you get from it can then be tested in that safer second layer or second circle?
You could. And I think finding an ally in that whether it's a support group or somebody who can meet you in it in a way that can actually understand. And when I talked about earlier, this person, I could see in their eyes something I had shared. I could see what that experience was for them. They've never experienced that themselves. But that was incredibly powerful because they can't actually understand it for themselves, but they understood me. And that's what we're looking for, is somebody who can understand. Because what did I say earlier? The problem is stemming from being misunderstood and the parenting that came with that and the responsibility and expectations that came with it, instead of parents who raised us as responsive and expectant in our life. Responsive to things and expectant. Be different then.
So many, yeah. So often you think of that next layer of having to be hundreds of individuals or hundreds of entities, but we can really whittle it down to maybe 3 or 4 key individuals or organizations or relationships where that support can be derived. And it's not this Herculean number that we need to have as an entourage of support, but it may really come down to some very key nurtured relationships where those entities or individuals will be there for you and you'll have a chance to reciprocate for them.
That's right. People who get us. And they might heal us in unexpected ways and we heal them. in different, unexpected ways. It's kind of magic. There's no, oh, I did that for you and you did that for me. It's just natural. Yeah.
For many of our caregivers listening today, they know that tomorrow they're going to have to wake up to another day of caregiving. And for the caregiver who can see the dysfunctional family pattern clearly, but still has to care tomorrow, what does it mean to have to keep showing up for real needs without surrendering their life to guilt, manipulation, coercion, and control moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, we could say mindset, we could say all these things, but I think that in this specific thing that you're asking, that is very difficult. And I would say try to recognize if you're doing any addictive patterns, like staying up late watching movies because you want time for yourself. But during the day, how can you use a different view of how that day looks? Like, yep, you probably have a repetition of the person needs medication. They need this, they need that at certain times of the day. But is there a moment, and this is tough, I get it. You're so busy, it seems insanely possible to squeeze something in. But can you take that cup of tea or coffee that you like and sit and look out the window for 2 minutes to just get a moment to get back with yourself? Because in my work, I would say the problem is, as a caregiver, you're constantly being stretched like elasto person to not be yourself. You're giving a lot to somebody else, their needs, and how do you meet a little bit of that during the day versus turning to something that could look like a different way of, I'm going to use the word addiction, but, kind of want, like at the end of the day, the thing that we do is how we feel about ourselves. Like if we eat a bunch of chocolate, it's quite telling. Like I used to smoke cigarettes because I was looking for love. And then the day that love came in, I stopped smoking and I never smoked again. Like it's very amazing why we do these things. But can you channel that into something that lets you be with you for a bit, not be the elasto person of, oh my gosh, I just sat down with the tea and the person's calling for me. It's going to be 2 minutes, and I realize some of those situations might be something extraordinary has happened and we have to go right now. But trying to get that. And the reason I say this is the more we pattern to things like that, the more we align with a way that works for us instead of working against us. And often the mental burden of what we're doing, and we can say emotional and physical, can be so lamented, like, oh, I can't do it again. I can't, that creates this, like, you sat down with the tea and now the person you're caring for all of a sudden had an accident or needs, it's tripping us up. We need to do the best we can to stay in alignment of this is going to work out. I'm going to have those 2 minutes for sure. Yeah, it's tricky.
So then, yeah, and it's hard. It's hard not to relinquish what those 2 minutes can be, as opposed to the win versus the loss of those 2 minutes. What kind of freedom is still possible then, when getting free may cost the caregiver the approval, sense of belonging, resources, or the family story they spent their life trying to survive?
Well, I think I'm going to answer this one in a way you might not expect, but we can also recognize, like I said, recognizing the guilt and shame and so on, recognizing what we have done that day or what we have done for this person, because you have accomplished something. You're keeping possibly somebody alive that if they didn't have this care, they wouldn't be able to continue maybe in the way that they have. They want to stay at home, or that whatever has been made allowed, you might feel hyper responsible for that. But the other thing is you've made that possible. And that's incredible. Like, what an incredible thing to give somebody. So there's a beauty in it too. And I think we have to look at that beauty of life. And we can see how messy it is when we're caregiving. And that can be funny and wild and absurd and awful and a whole bunch of things. But, it also can be this beautiful engagement with that person in a different way. I know, I'm going to say this quick, but my mom had a knee replacement and she's not an athlete. I'm the athlete in the family. And she finally called me over and she said, I know that you will make me do my exercises. So I'm calling on you because you won't mind if it hurts. And that sounds awful. But she's right, because I'm an athlete and I know how to push through. And it's not that I don't care for her, but I'd make her laugh when it hurt. I would help her through it in another way. And it made this beautiful, and I felt what a beautiful thing for her to call on me because she knows she has to do it and she won't. And here she is asking for that help. I thought, this is lovely. So we can look to some of those pieces as a lovely moment to exchange. Yeah.
Before we end today, one thing that just sort of came to mind as I was reflecting on what you were saying is that for the caregiver wondering if they are enough, or for the caregiver who's trying to see whether everything they've done today was actually an amazing contribution to someone else. If you're starting to see that, I think that's the first sign that your authentic self and that deep personal knowing is coming to the forefront.
It is. And that is hard won in a world society the way it's shaped. So if you're doing any of that, huzzah. I mean, like amazing, and kudos. Yeah.
So the path is tough, but it's achievable, and don't give up.
It is. And if you're doing it among this level of intensity, you're a champion. So if you can do it here, you quite honestly can apply it anywhere else in your life. And that's powerful.
Thanks for reminding us that caregivers are champions. Amy, we've loved having you here back as a guest. You've really made a big difference in this conversation and to our listeners. That wraps up today's episode. We'll see you again next week at the Caregivers podcast. Till we meet again.
Thanks, Mark.
I think one of the clearest reminders from this episode is that seeing the family pattern is not the same as being free from it. A caregiver can do the work and become more aware. They can name what is unfair, understand how they were pulled into it, and recognize the pressure that's kept them compliant. But that does not mean the family will change with them. In some families, the pattern pushes back. It may show up as guilt, silence, punishment, manipulation, threats around money, or withdrawal of help, with a painful realization that the person telling the truth is now being treated as the problem. And that can be incredibly lonely. And for many caregivers, it creates a painful choice. They may still need to care. A parent may still have real needs. The situation may not allow for a clean break. But real care need not require a caregiver to surrender their dignity, their health, or their life to a family dynamic that's been hurting them for years. For anyone listening who can now see the pattern clearly, I hope this conversation helps you feel less alone. I hope it reminds you that the family does not have to agree before your reality is valid. And I hope it gives you permission to protect your own life, even if other people preferred you and you were easier to control. You may still have to care tomorrow, but you don't have to disappear in order to do it. Before you go, please subscribe or follow the Caregivers podcast wherever you're listening. It's free, it helps support the show, and it helps these conversations reach more caregivers and families who may need them. And if the Caregivers podcast has been helpful to you, please consider buying the team a coffee. We're a new independent show, and every bit of support helps us keep bringing these conversations to caregivers each week. The Buy Me a Coffee link is in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.